I'm Vice Signal, and this is Cancel Lincoln.
Just like the South secession from the Union preceded the Civil War, the secession from the British Empire of the 13 colonies that would become the United States in 1776 preceded the American Revolution. The only difference between these two secessions is that the Confederacy was prevented from achieving its independence, but the principles behind each were the same: resistance to tyranny, liberty, and self-governance. The biased modern textbooks cynically label the former a rebellion and euphemistically call the latter a revolution, showing once again that the victors of wars are the ones who get to decide how history is told. But glorification aside, the famous Declaration of Independence was in essence the 13 American colonies saying that they were not content being ruled by the British king, and therefore had a fundamental human right to claim their independence from his authority. This set an early precedent in American politics that a people breaking away from a government they feel does not represent its interests is as American as apple pie. But despite this honored heritage, Lincoln committed the betrayal of denying the Southern people, his fellow countrymen, their right to self-determination, using his rhetorical talents to portray the secession of the Southern states as a mere civil agitation, rather than the legitimate and democratically decided independence movement that it was. Southern state legislators and ordinary citizens alike all voted in majorities for independence, and in some cases, overwhelming majorities. Some examples of this were the Mississippi legislature, which voted to secede, 84 in favor to 15 against. Florida, 62-7, Alabama, 61-39, Georgia, 208-89, Louisiana, 113-7, Texas, 166-7, and Virginia, 85-55. Additionally, in a Virginia public referendum, the people voted in favor of independence, 96,750 to 32,134. But to Lincoln, it made no difference. In his mind, he, a ruler in Washington, D.C., had more of a right to decide how Southerners lived their lives than they did themselves. Him portraying Southern secession as a rebellion against a central authority in a foreign state, in fact, only credited its political legitimacy. After all, the American Revolution was a rebellion. Furthermore, the U.S. Constitution allows for secession via the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which states, quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." Close quote. This means that if the Constitution does not say that the government may prevent a state from leaving the Union, which it does not, then it may not stop a state from doing so. It also means that if the Constitution does not say that an action is prohibited to the states, then the states may decide for themselves if that action is allowed within it. The Constitution does not say that secession is prohibited. Therefore, states may secede. Period. This understanding was shared by even the bitterest of enemies amongst the Founding Fathers, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. During the process of ratifying the Constitution in 1788, Hamilton denounced the idea of the federal government ever using violence against the states, saying, quote, "To coerce the states is one of the maddest projects that was ever devised. What picture does this idea present to our view? A compliant state at war with a non-compliant state? Congress marching the troops of one state into the bosom of another? Here is a nation at war with itself. Can any reasonable man be well disposed toward a government which makes war and carnage the only means of supporting itself? A government that can exist only by the sword?" Close quote. Hamilton clearly would never have condoned Lincoln's war against the South, and most certainly neither would have Jefferson, who said, commenting on the New England secession movement, which gained momentum following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, quote, "Let them part by all means, if it be for their happiness to do so. It is but the elder and the younger son differing. God bless them both, and keep them in union if it be for their good, but separate them if better." Close quote. And also saying in his first presidential inaugural address in 1801, quote, "If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve the Union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left to combat it." Close quote. Furthermore, in his Kentucky Resolution of 1798, Jefferson asserted that the states could decide for themselves if the actions of the federal government were constitutional or not, and not the federal Supreme Court unilaterally, as it does today. And so, it is clear from the writings of the founders of the United States of America, even those in opposing political factions, that the right of secession was the primary principle behind the American Revolution, followed by the right to political sovereignty. And yet, the Confederacy was invaded and is still castigated today for trying to assert these American tenets for itself. As a matter of fact, 12 of George Washington's family members fought for the Confederacy, which included General Robert E. Lee. The colonies recognized one another as individual sovereign nations before and after the American Revolution, and were also recognized as such by the British King within the Treaty of Paris that ended the war. On top of that, upon joining the Union, some states, including Virginia, stipulated within their own state constitutions that if the federal government ever became abusive of its powers, then they reserved the right to resume their full sovereignty, like they had before they ratified the federal constitution. These were known as resumption clauses, and by creating a union compact with Virginia, the northern states were agreeing that they had no right to interfere if Virginia chose to invoke them. In the political science world, what we colloquially usually think of as a country is called a nation-state. At no point have the United States ever been one singular nation-state, hence the plural name, United States. It is a union of individually sovereign nations that created a compact in the form of the Constitution, which would serve as a military alliance and facilitate seamless interstate trade. It is a federal republic. Therefore, Lincoln's claim that state secession was unconstitutional because it was a quote-unquote rebellion against the United States had no basis in law, history, or common sense, which invalidates his justification for using violence to force the South into staying, while speaking volumes about his character. And since we've already established that Lincoln starting the Civil War was not about ending slavery, as proven by him attempting to have an amendment passed to make slavery permanent in the Constitution in order to appease the South into voluntarily rejoining the Union, known as the Corwin Amendment, and by the example of Lincoln firing 2 of his generals in the early days of the war for freeing slaves and then returning the slaves to their masters, and not to mention the fact that the North had hundreds of thousands of slaves before, during, and after the war, we can see the invasion of the South in response to it exercising its legitimate constitutional right of self-determination for the naked power grab of an aspiring dictator that it was. Ironically, the would-be autocrat had previously paid lip service to the right of secession, stating in 1848 that, quote, any people, anywhere, being inclined and having the power, have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government, and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world. Nor is this right confined to cases in which the whole people of an existing government may choose to exercise it. Any portion of such people that may revolutionize and make their own of so much of the territory as they inhabit. Close quote. And yet, at the start of the war, he refused to meet with Confederate commissioners to discuss a peace settlement, claiming that to do so would be to recognize the sovereignty of the Confederacy and legitimacy of their separation from the United States. And thus, his words in support of secession were a ruse, made even more transparent following the war, when Lincoln ordered that the South be ruled by a military dictatorship and banned former Confederate soldiers from political participation. But if the Confederate States were in fact not sovereign and part of the Union all throughout the war, as Lincoln claimed by refusing to meet with them, then this action was appallingly unconstitutional, as there is no right for a president to disincorporate states. To further tease out the point, 2 days before Lincoln's presidential inauguration, one of his colleagues, Republican Senator James R. Doolittle of Wisconsin, felt the need to propose a constitutional amendment forbidding state secession. Why would that be necessary if secession was self-evidently unconstitutional, as believed by Lincoln and many in the Republican Party? In summary, when initially approaching the question of the legality of secession, Lincoln and the Republicans answered it with uncertainty at best and deceptively at worst, because it was far from a foregone conclusion. After the war, however, when the smoke dissipated, the answer would become clear. Secession was legal, and the Yankee federal government would do everything in its power to make sure the criminality of their conquest was hidden from the public. To do this, the federal government would go as far as sabotaging its own prosecution against the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, for treason.
Thank you for watching that episode of Cancel Lincoln. If you enjoyed the video, do me a favor, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel while you're at it. It really goes a long way in spreading the content. Thank you again, fellow rabble-rousers.